Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone, my name is Nicholas Prohodko and I am co-chair of the Council's Research Committee and Director of Research at the ICCS. Welcome to this webinar presenting the Deloitte study on innovative self-service practices commissioned by the Joint Council's Research Committee on behalf of the PSSDC and PSCIOC. This is the second of two webinars on the study and will focus on the self-service maturity model developed as part of that study. Self-service has been identified by the councils as a key research priority in forming and supporting the goals of more cost-effective and better quality services to citizens and businesses. The purpose of the study is to give council and research committee members a clearer understanding of the trends in self-service in both the public and private sectors, nationally and internationally, and the implications for Canadian public sector service providers. The format of today's webinar will include a presentation by Deloitte, followed by Q's and A's. You can send in your questions as they occur to you in the course of the presentation using the chat box on your screen. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Richard Carson, the partner at Deloitte responsible for guiding this study. Richard is a leader in Deloitte's customer practice in Canada with a particular focus on citizen service delivery across channels. His consulting focus across Canadian and international clients is on customer and citizen growth strategy, multi-channel operations, government strategy for economic and business growth, customer service, and customer-focused transformations. Richard has over 10 years experience in senior roles in the private retail sector and 17 years of global consulting experience. His focus at Deloitte is to help public sector clients link strategic plans around customer, citizens, channels, and products with action and implementation in the marketplace. Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Nicholas, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon from rainy downtown Toronto, and good morning for those of you out in the West Coast. As Nicholas mentioned, this webinar is the second in a series. I think a number of you hopefully participated last week in the session we had, where we presented an overview of the study we did back in the fall, I think at a higher level describe some of the insights, some of the trends. But as Nicholas mentioned, what we want to do today on the second webinar is go a lot deeper into the maturity model. So as part of this initiative, what we developed together with a number of you folks is what we're calling a self-service maturity model that helps you take a look at the practices that you've got across different dimensions, helps you, first of all, have what I'm going to call an apples-to-apples conversation about how well you're doing relative to your peers, or perhaps relative to best practices, or perhaps relative to where you think you want to go in the future. But this can be a great tool to assess yourself, and most importantly, to have a good dialogue with your colleagues or with peers from other organizations. And so the way we're going to manage this webinar is I'm just going to spend a very few minutes up front on an overview of the study for those of you who were not able to participate last week, and then go a little bit deeper into the self-service maturity model. So if you're looking at your screen, hopefully you see actually the same document that we used last week, and of course this third objective being to introduce the self-service maturity model is what we're going to focus on. But just first, very briefly, for those of you who were not able to attend, a reminder, attend our seminar last week. So this was a 12-week study we conducted back in the fall in the sort of October to December timeframe, really looking at leading practices in self-serve, but more specifically, as you can see on the left of this slide, areas such as identity management, multi-channel management, the migration of services across channels, end-to-end service integration, and service bundling. And I'm going to, the report is out. I think it's accessible to all of you, so you can see the more detailed Word report. I'm just going to flip through a few of these slides. The context again for service in Canada we talked about last week, fiscal pressures, fragmented programs, technology, which is evolving very, very quickly, and very much so the growing demand, the growing sophistication and diversity of clients. What I want to get to, though, as you can see, I'm flipping through this document, is the section where we did not spend as much time last week, and that is here on our self-service maturity framework. So as a reminder, what this document is a tool. And I'm going to say it's a subjective tool. It's a living tool, meaning that it's one that you can customize to your specific organization or your specific business model or your specific service objectives. And it's one that you definitely have to update over time because, as we all know, this whole sector is evolving very, very quickly. But really, the intent of it is for you to work with your people across your organization. And I say that because this can be a great training tool. It can be a great workshop tool that you don't need us or anyone else. You can do it internally around a table and have a great conversation about how well you're doing, again, versus where you want to be or versus best practice. But what you'll see as we get into the tool is that there are really 4 sections to it. These 4 characteristics that we decided to organize the tool, or 4 key dimensions, being your channels of contact, your channels of service, the actual client functions, in other words, the type of activities that are supported by self-service, management focus, and then finally, technology and infrastructure. On the next slide here, hopefully what you can see, and I'm just going to click, there we go. I just went to my full screen, and now hopefully you can see the full screen, so it's a little bit better for you. But on this maturity framework, what you can see is we've taken these elements of channels, client functions, management functions, and finally of technology and infrastructure, and we've organized these into a number of subcomponents. And the maturity model is, in fact, organized along these subcomponents. And so this is the key slide that I think is really important to bear in mind as we go through this. This is the organizing framework, if you will, for the maturity model. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, if you want to customize the maturity model for your own specific business model or objectives, this is where you can look at these elements and perhaps add in some of your own content, some of your own dimensions that might make sense. As I go along, and what we've done is hopefully you've all received probably about half an hour ago an email from Robert at ICCS, and we could not get the actual maturity model online, but hopefully those of you who are online and received the email will have received an Excel file, which is in fact the maturity model. And so I'm going to describe it, but for those of you who are in front of your computers and online, you might want to open that file now. But what you'll see, and this slide I'm on right now, is an illustration of what it looks like. And you'll see the way it's organized is that for any given function and for any given capability, we've listed 5 stages of progression, or 5 stages of maturity. We've labeled them on the far left emergent, which is a very basic stage. You have a very basic capability. You might be either very new to this capability or have a very minimal level of capability. And as you migrate right across this to developing, what we call defined, what we call mature, and then finally what we call transformative, or perhaps best practice, you see that that capability gets more and more sophisticated. And I think the important note here is that this is a qualitative description, as you can see. What we've tried to do is we've tried to say, here are 5 distinct stages that you might be able to describe for any given capability. And the point of this whole model is to look at any given topic and try to decide where are you? Where are you on that capability? What number? Is it a very basic number 1? versus on the far right, of course, a very best practice or transformative number 5. And then as I'll show you in the tool, what you can do with this is you can scan through every single capability area and score yourself. Score yourself to how well you're doing. But I would suggest more importantly than the number, whether it's a 2 or a 3 or a 4, it's why you feel you've scored it. So what we've done is we've, through the best practice research, through a number of the interviews we've done, we've tried to put a simple description of what each of these 5 levels are. But the, as I say, the priority is to say, why did you rank it a 3 or why did you rank it a 4? What's the gap that you have between that ranking that you gave it and what that best practice description is? And that's essentially how the tool is used. I'm just going to continue through these slides, and then I'm going to go into detail on a bunch of examples. Within the tool as well, what you'll see is 2 types of scoring mechanisms. The first on the slide that I'm showing you right now, the self-assessment tool, basically allows you, again, to write down what you think that maturity level is. And this is how you can assess your own maturity in your mind against each of the key functions. You can do it over time. So, for example, you can do it at the start of this year, at the start of perhaps a new fiscal year, 12 months later, measure it again. You can do it relative to other peers in your organization. So this is a great cross-functional tool to get a workshop together and to have all of you rate these elements, and then you have a great discussion about why one person or one group thought it might have been a 2, another might be a 4. You can also rate it against best practice and where you want to be in the future. Because a key learning we've got from this is that you can't be best practice at every single capability in self-service. As we went through the best practice research, we spoke to a number of organizations, both here in Canada and abroad. They all told us that none of them have realized the full journey or the full capabilities they would like to have. In other words, they all went through a maturity framework similar to this in one version or another and decided where they want to focus. Where do they want to focus their capabilities? Where do they want to build up? And what other capabilities might not be as much of a priority that perhaps they could leave for another year or future at some point? And so the message is you cannot be, it's very difficult to be absolutely best practice at all of these dimensions. Where do you want to prioritize and focus? Either based on the organizational strategy, your objectives, or perhaps based on some of the gaps you've got and where you want to focus your investments. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, for those of you who do have the Excel spreadsheet open, I'm just going to focus on that for a couple of minutes, and hopefully this will work. If you don't have the Excel sheet open, what I'm going to try to do is just describe this and try to keep it as simple as I can. So for those of you with the Excel sheet, and hopefully people are familiar with Excel, you can look at the tabs on the bottom. You can see there are tabs called Introduction, and if you go there, there's a tab called Channels, Client Functions, Management Functions, and Technology. So those are each of the 4 dimensions, again, that we decided to organize this model around. And then 2 types of assessments. And really that's the summary of how to score all this, and I'll show you that in a minute. So if you could please just quickly go to the tab that's called Introduction. Again, this is just a simple way to hopefully explain this to your colleagues. So it's a bit of a turnkey tool that if it's designed well, we hope that it can be simple to use, but of course very, very effective. And you can see there's a little bit of an introduction at the top of this, describing what it is, describing the different dimensions, the 4 different dimensions, as well as the 5-point scale. And what we've got is an easy way to jump through the various elements of the tool so you can quickly navigate. So after that introduction, if I can please ask you to jump to the tab that says Channels. So again, Channels is one of the 4 different dimensions that we've organized this. And you'll see a common window here that we use for all the descriptions. And the way it's organized, again, you've got these 5 different stages, from emergent or most basic on the left to transformative or best practice on the right. And the way these work is it takes each dimension, so obviously this one is called channels, and it starts at the very top with a higher level description of what we mean by each of these 5 stages. So if you think of the notion of channels, if you're emergent or very, very basic, the description we've come up with, for those of you who can see this, is that basically you've got digital services, you've got channels, you've got strategies that are either limited or non-existent. And you do not have, you have not implemented a set of formal practices and processes. So it's very, very basic service, very limited service. Whereas if you're developing, what we have said is that you do have multi-channel service that's being planned and developed. You do have some degree of formality in how you're implementing, but often a commonality of this developing stage is you lack consistency. Either you lack consistency across the channels that you're working in, or often you're lacking consistency across the services or the programs that you've got. Maybe you chose one program to go with online self-service, but many other programs do not have that yet. So that lack of consistency is there. A little further right, and you are definitely implementing multi-channel practices. There's formal procedures, there's policies that you're consistently applying across channels and across programs, and you start to align these with organizational strategies as well. Going yet another stage to mature, what we're saying is that you've expanded your program, they are becoming refined. We all know that with any citizen service initiative, often the best laid plans on paper need to get refined once we get into execution and understand the real impact of our services on citizens. So you have refined these, you have edited them. There's a focus, an increasing focus on the end user, and we have a systematic degree of measurement. And so we're looking at things like efficiency, which might be time or cost efficiency. We're looking at metrics such as effectiveness, the degree to which we're delivering effective service or providing an effective environment for our staff, whether it's CSRs or other staff who interact with citizens. And we truly are building value. That's what we call a mature stage. And then finally, we've come up with a description for transformative, or what you might call best practices, which is really where your multi-channel efforts are optimized. You could say that they're user-centric. There's high levels of integration across the channels, across your services. You've got your implementation is sustainable. You've got KPIs or targets that are consistently achieved or exceeded. And I think that this last one perhaps is a way to show that this whole tool is qualitative in the descriptions that we've come up with. So for example, some of you might be thinking, well, we use the term user-centric here. What does that really mean? And I think the point is, for each organization, that term user-centric or citizen-centric might mean something slightly different. And so we're trying not to define it too specifically here, but allow you the flexibility to put in your own definition for your organization. Our definition, by the way, is that you understand citizens' needs, you're meeting citizens' needs, but doing that in an efficient manner. As you can see then below, what we've done is we've taken each of the sub-elements for these dimensions. So again, this one is channel. We've got essentially one sub-element for each major channel we find people are typically working with. So one for multi-channel choice or access, one for mobile, one for kiosk, one for tablet, one for phone and IVR. So there's 5 different ones. The way this whole tool works, for those of you who are at your computer, is if you look at column D, Column D will show you a number, and you'll see if you click on column D, there's a little bit of a choice that you can give it anywhere from a scoring of 1 to 5. Whatever you score it, that number will automatically get populated in the assessment summary. And so if I can just ask you to quickly go to the assessment summary, and that tab you'll see on the bottom, it's just a little further to the right. And what the assessment summary does is this automatically takes that scoring you just gave it, okay, and it populates this. You can go through each of the various dimensions and each of the sub-elements of the whole tool, and this will give you a score that you can add up, an overall average and a total score. And what this has done, by the way, is this weights it, so that we've given each of these 4 dimensions equal weighting. But I think the important part that I wanted to mention is that you can see on this assessment summary the far right. And the far right are observations. And again, this is where, when you use this as a tool, either with your people that you're trying to train, or perhaps with other organizations that you're doing a peer-to-peer review, this is where the qualitative comments are so important. So for example, using my comment about citizen-centric, that might require some comment about what does it mean for you to be citizen-centric, and why is it that you only gave this particular topic or capability a scoring of 1, 2, or 3. And so my point is that even though we have this scoring mechanism for all of the elements here, it's the qualitative comment and the conversation that then ensues that is so critical. And this is where the value of the tool is. The value of the tool is not necessarily the number that you assign it, but that's the conversation starter that allows you to really look at what kind of capabilities are you missing, what kind of gaps, or what kind of investments, what kind of initiatives might that lead to. So I'm going to flip back, and again, for those of you in front of your computer, if you could please go to the tab that says Client Functions. And again, client functions is the second dimension. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly, and this has 11. So this has 11 different sub-elements to it. But just to quickly go through that very top row again, which is looking at client functions at the highest level. So again, as you can see in row 3, stage 1, which is emergent or very, very basic, that you really have limited or non-existent client functions. What that really means is you don't have a lot of formal practices. Your processes are perhaps very inconsistent. What I often say is this is where you're either leaving it to the citizen to navigate their way through your service offering, or often what we see in very basic organizations is they leave it to the interpretation of the CSR or the client service person who's offering service at front lines to think of in their best ways, think of the best ways to service customers, service citizens, and basically doing it themselves. Which often, by the way, doesn't have a bad impact, but it's the inconsistency, and it's leaving it to people's best judgment to devise that service. But then, as you can see, going a little further right to developing, the notion of client functions is we're starting to proactively plan them and develop them. You're implementing them with some degree of formality, but again, you still lack some consistency. As you go further to defined, you've got formal procedures, you've got policies, you've got a good degree of process in place, and you've got alignment with your organizational strategies. So, for example, the roles that you've got, the ways that you're holding people accountable, even the job descriptions are aligned to the client functions, the way you want service to be delivered. A little further right yet, mature stage is when you're expanding your programs, you're refining them. You've got, again, an increasing focus on the end user. This is where topics like proactive problem resolution, as an example, are often seen. You've got continuous innovation. In other words, your practices, your processes are continually being refined, often in a formal way where you evaluate them once a year. You're systematically measuring the impact you've got, again, using KPIs, whether it's around efficiency or perhaps effectiveness. And then finally, the last one, very similar to what we were saying before, you've optimized your functions. They very much are user-centric, very much integrated across your organization. Your service practices are sustainable. In other words, you've got this continuous innovation built in. You've got communication going internally of what kind of best practices are working, what kind of lessons learned that you can then embed in. And if you look underneath, what you'll see, again, are, and in this particular dimension of client functions, you can see there are a number of more detailed capabilities that we've got. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to put these in as much of a citizen-centric or citizen view as we could. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of a citizen trying to get service, typically what they're doing is they're first trying to get information. They're trying to get basic information. They're trying to search. They're trying to access us. So citizen access is that very first level. Then we have what we call a knowledge base. They're trying to, once they access us, to get specific knowledge about the type of service. It could be basic knowledge, such as opening hours or directions, or it could be more complex knowledge, such as how do you qualify for a particular service, specific rules perhaps, how are services bundled together. The third one is managing identity. Which we all know is a very important topic, identity management. The fourth one is how they apply and pay for services, and that's basically service integration. Versus applying and paying, we broke out as a separate row where they have a specific application they need to fill out. And as you can imagine, the application one can vary quite a bit from it's not available in terms of a self-service way to a true end-to-end online application. You have a sixth one, which is around eligibility, which we find is a topic that is very, very important, especially when you have a complex set of programs that can evolve, and eligibility is very important to try to deliver in a self-service management manner. You have a seventh around managing cases and adjudicating, which obviously is where you have more interaction. It might be a partial self-service offering, but you do at times need to interact with a staff person or perhaps a program specialist. The eighth one is to notify the citizens. Perhaps there's several steps involved. Notify they've been accepted or that no more information is needed. Service fulfillment might be the completion of that transaction, whether it's as simple as receipt is issued out or some sort of proof that you've got that service fulfilled, a driver's license or a passport as an example. And then number 10 goes into problem resolution, which again could be done entirely by self-service or perhaps assisted self-service. And then we've added in an 11th one, and the 11th capability here is more what we call public forums. So it's problem resolution and service support more through public forums, where you're using different types of, whether it's social media or other sorts of customer panels or other kinds of public forums to help proactively identify problems and resolve them, so that the citizens can get as close to a one-stop kind of service as possible. I'm going to move on then. So those are the citizen-facing functions. If you, those of you in front of your computer, you then go down to the next tab, which is management functions. And I think rather than going through, you can see that on that top row, row 3, a very, again, similar sort of way to describe these at a high level. But then as you go down the very left-hand side, so in other words, column C on this, what you'll see on this one is even a broader set. And I'm going to just talk through these a little bit, because on this one, we've actually got 28 different management functions. So for the most part, these are things that would go on behind the scenes, what you need to do to manage citizen service that isn't as much customer or citizen facing. So just quickly to maybe try to explain a bunch of these. And again, just a reminder that the intent of this isn't to say that every single organization needs this capability, but what we try to do is to devise a tool that might be as useful for a broad set of organizations. So this is exactly where you might want to customize. And you might want to say, as you go through this, understanding how this is organized, you might say, well, 28 management functions, that's not really relevant for our organization, but certainly a subset of them might be. And so you don't have to score every single thing. Or you could have a conversation that only is about management and not some of the other topics, such as the citizen-facing stuff, or such as the technology topics that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. So just a reminder that you don't have to use this whole tool. You can pick it apart, you can use bits and pieces, but most importantly, you can customize it for your own business model. So just to start with, row number 5 on this management function dimension talks about service strategy and policy. And without going into detail on, again, the 5 different stages, what we find that there's often a real variance out in the marketplace, in the people we spoke to and the research we did, on the degree to which you actually have a proactive strategy for service in place, to which you have proactive policies and procedures. And this is where the whole notion of what do you want multi-channel management to be is really important. The second one on client insights, I would argue a lot of organizations have, whether you call it client insights, whether you call it research, but it's the idea of understanding not just the kind of service needs that clients have, but it's the service experience that they have. So as they interact with you, what is that experience like for them? Are you getting insights about that, about what is working well and what is not? And then applying those insights back into your business model to be able to hopefully continually improve either the efficiency or the effectiveness. The third one is about, again, service strategy and policy, but more about client and channel data. And I think as we spoke on the webinar last week, the notion of data is becoming more and more important. A lot of data that organizations will have, and provided they're managing them in an appropriate manner from a privacy standpoint, from a security standpoint, the analytics that we see people using on-channel and client data are becoming more and more sophisticated. And the question is, what are you doing with your data? Are you using it to continually help improve either that experience or that efficiency? Again, those 2 high-level objectives that most people seem to be focused on. The fourth one, which is row 8, is again strategy and policy, this time on channel choice and preference. The idea that we typically in government might want to offer citizens self-service and a choice of channels, but we often are not willing or don't want to go to the extent of demanding they use one channel over another. So, for example, we talked last week about the general migration of services to online self-service, but the idea that there will always be citizens who are either unwilling or unable to work in that kind of manner, and for whom live service over the phone or perhaps in-person service, whether it's retail or some other counter location, is still required. The channel choice and preference is certainly a capability in there. We have row number 5, which is, element number 5, which again under service strategy and policy is client participation and channel adoption. We have number 6, which is around segmentation. I think as we've seen, and we didn't define this too specifically because there are so many ways that we see people segmenting citizens out there. It could be a general demographic segmentation. It could be based on propensity to do self-service. It could be based on either attitudinal or behavioral dimensions. But the question is, do you have some degree of segmentation? And that we find is quite important. We have service bundles is the 7th one. where we see more and more, again, in terms of management functions, is some degree of bundling of services, whether it's based on life event, whether it's based on common attributes of other means, but we see service bundling certainly the capability that most organizations are talking about, if not already doing at some point or another. And it could be bundling simply in terms of your people, in terms of having your people being able to deliver multiple services, or it could be straight to the self-service citizens get. And again, their ability to get more than one service on any given occasion. To the point where perhaps you're proactively suggesting that if they are, for example, applying for a birth certificate, there might be other services related to that birth life event that they should be aware of that they can accomplish at the same time. The idea of a service catalog is number 8, in that very interesting, we find that a lot of organizations on the left-hand side of this and the more basic elements don't even know all the services they offer. Internally, that is. So the staff don't even know, management often doesn't know, because they are done in a rather siloed way across multiple participating organizations. I've certainly seen that in a bunch of cases. Whereas the far right of this service catalog is an easy ability, not just for citizens, but also for your staff, to understand what services are offered, and everything from information about them to how do you qualify, and so on. Number 9 is around social media and public forums, which again we're finding more and more organizations, I would suggest a few years ago, were testing, but more and more now we see them much more formally embedding various social media, public forums to get input, embedding that into their processes. Number 10 is all around email management, how you're organizing your email capability, assuming that's a channel you've got. I'm just going to pick up the pace here because I do want to leave lots of time at the end for questions or conversation. Number 11 is around policy frameworks. Number 12 is around marketing and communications. Some of these, again, might not apply to all organizations, but we try to create as broad a scope as might be prudent. Incentives and penalties to influence certain digital services. So, for example, this could be an incentive to use one type of channel, a web channel, over another. Could be, for example, pricing incentives. Open data and competitions is number 14. We talked about user feedback and SAT measures, which are very important. We talked about standardized processes, and this one I want to spend a minute on because I think this is very, very important. Where in the past, a lot of departments or services didn't have to have standard processes because they didn't have standard approaches to their channels. But now that you, in many cases, are looking at self-service in a more systematic way across services, that then forces you to look at some of your basic processes to say, are we doing things in a consistent manner, in the most efficient manner possible? And that could be basics, like the kind of information you're looking for, to how often you request updates from citizens. But the point is that there's often an opportunity here to standardize processes, and I would suggest that's where you really can get a lot of efficiency savings. So my point on this particular one, number 16, on management functions, is this was where you can also go deeper from organization into organization and come up with the sub-elements of that particular one that might be applicable to you. Execution of projects and processes is important. And I think the reason is there's no shortage of good ideas we typically find. A lot of this information that we talked about this week and last week is not new, but it's the manner in which you proceed with them. It's the degree to which you can focus on certain initiatives as opposed to try to do everything at once, which often doesn't lead to the quality result you want. So it's how you're executing various self-service initiatives is the focus of this number 17. Process compliance is important. The degree to which your people are working with processes in a common way, in the way that in that standard way that you've set up. We've got financial management and performance frameworks, which again is a very, very important one. We've got data and info analytics. We've got value management. Are you getting the value out of your processes? Funding, which is an important element. How are you funding? Is this coming from various government departments? Is it a service that citizens are paying for? You can see others include capacity management. Do you have the capacity to take on more? Digital program management, culture and governance around your people. And then we get into topics like training and skills. We proactively try to isolate change management, because change management is something that we find not all organizations are proactive with. Some of them are very much reactive too. But those who really, we believe, excel at self-service have a more proactive approach, not just to training and skills, but actually to change management. They embed that in the corporate culture, embed that in the processes. So that was a long one, obviously 28 elements. And then you can see the final one, which is technology and infrastructure. And those of you with the Excel spreadsheet on your computer, if you don't mind going to that, you'll see we also, in this case, have 13 different elements. I think it's important, we obviously put technology and infrastructure last, because you have, and I'll quickly go through them, and we try to carve this section up into, I would say, a logical grouping. I mean, you could come up with dozens of elements for this, but we thought this might be a good place to start, especially one that might be understandable for people who aren't technology specialists, people who maybe focus on frontline service, but who are able to look at this tool and therefore, rather than always complaining about technology doesn't work, really going into a little more detail about what aspect of technology is it that we're not quite getting the support that we need. And so again, the usefulness, we think, of this tool to help train, help have apples-to-apples conversations, but not force people to be technology specialists in order to get value out of this tool, or also to, of course, add value as they try to score these elements. So you can see channels and channel support services is one. We've got transaction support. We've got service workflow. In other words, imaging and how services are being presented. We've got the business rules. And business rules, I would suggest, can be very, very similar to processes. But the actual business rules about what kinds of ways do we deliver service, and more from a technology standpoint, are they encoded in different applications? Are they easily understood, easily retrieved, and do they work not just for the citizen, but for your staff using them as well? You've got the more technical side of, as you can see, the fifth item is information architecture. Excuse me, service components, infrastructure. We then go into enterprise content, which I'll stop for a minute because I think that's another very, very important one. Gets into topics like knowledge management. But how is content stored? How is it accessed? And how is it updated is a key aspect of self-service. And I think this is an important one as well, because as people use this self-service maturity model and they get into topics like this one on enterprise content, they often realize how complex it can be to launch a self-service initiative. And I think this is what you might call a humbling kind of capability, because it will really push the conversation about what is required to deliver good self-service. And more often than not, I find it actually delays the implementation, the development of a business case or the implementation of it, because it shows how complex this can be. Again, I think a key lesson that we talked about last week is it's often better to delay self-service, to not offer self-service, than to offer bad self-service or inconsistent self-service, where you don't have the content updated and you're just going to create a worse service experience as a result. So just moving on a bit, standards, technology standards are very important. Security is obviously an aspect, whether it's data security, security of your applications, Privacy, we all know, is quite critical, and so and I would suggest most organizations these days have a pretty good, from a technology standpoint, a pretty good privacy capability, though this allows you to have that next level conversation about it. Moving on, we've got service components, we've got management and alignment of that. We've got the adaptation for legacy systems, and this isn't always applicable, but I think for those of you who know that you're migrating from one system to another, that's where things again can be pretty complex, whether it's from a data standpoint, app standpoint, or user experience. And then finally, in this technology and infrastructure section, we do have a section, as you can see, on data warehousing and integrating data that might be in external sources. So those are a pretty quick sort of overview of all of these elements. As I say, if you can then quickly go to the assessment summary, this is where, just as a summary, you can see that in this particular case, for those of you who have the Excel spreadsheet, this has been assigned a rating that was done in development, but this is where you can do it on your own. You can go through one or any combination of all of these capabilities. You can adapt them. And then as you look on slide, on the tab that says assessment chart, you can see a traditional spider diagram that can be a really nice way to, again, assess where you are. And again, this might be relative to best practice, it may be relative to an objective of where you want to be. So that's where you've got that ideal versus the weighted average that you've scored. And then finally, if you can look at assessment chart number 2, which is a more traditional line graph that can show, again, where you are. And this is just using a very traditional sort of red, yellow, green shading to say, which of the sub-elements that you've assessed are most concern or biggest gap to where you want to be. So I think, Nicholas, I better maybe stop there and leave some time for questions or comments. But just as a summary, this was one part of the initiative that we did for this project. We tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. It's always a bit of a tricky balance to be simple and user-friendly, but at the same time deep enough with insights. I would just, remind you, it's always fun to give a certain capability of scoring from 1 to 5, but I would always find the more interesting activities. Why did you give it that number? What's that capability? What are we missing in the organization that made you feel that way? And just, again, a reminder to use this in conjunction with the broader report that we did, whether it's specific case studies or some of the other lessons learned that can hopefully then become a good tool to discuss your own maturity, your own capability of self-service, and where you want to go in the future and how you want to prioritize. So I think we've got a good 10 minutes left, and I'm interested in any comments or questions or suggestions of how you feel about this tool.
Well, thank you, Richard. That's really quite an impressive, from my perspective, representation of a very robust and thoughtful tool that really represents all of the key dimensions of self-service and developing particularly a strategic and organizational, operational approach to the delivery of or moving an organization towards self-service in a thoughtful and planned way. So I can see how your experience in helping organizations to frame strategic approaches and aligning their strategic plans with directions that move towards better integration with self-service approaches to client service delivery has played itself out in what you've been able to develop and present for us today. The floor is open for questions. So again, if you have questions specifically or more generally, or comments that you would like to make, share with Richard, please use the chat box in the lower right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be happy to put them to Richard for a response or comment. Alternatively, we could end the session, but let's give it a few more moments. I guess from my perspective, I'd be curious to know if any of the participants in the webinar could see themselves potentially using this tool or part of the tool or this kind of an approach in helping to conduct an assessment of where they're at in terms of their self-service capability, and potentially using it as a framework to develop a go-forward strategy. As one of the products that Deloitte has delivered to the ICCS as part of this project, this is potentially a tool that the ICCS could take and frame and push out and put on its roster of tools and approaches that members of the ICCS could take advantage of. There are some questions that have now come forward, so let's give those a go. First comment is, this is an impressive tool. Are there any items more critical than others, or is there a light version of this tool?
That's interesting. Thanks for the question. Sometimes I get the opposite. Is there a more complex or in-depth version? I'd say the answer is pick the pieces that for you work best for the audience you're speaking to. So, for some people, again, that whole technology section is not going to be relevant. For others, they might just pick one or two elements of technology, such as whether it's the privacy one or some other. I think it really depends upon your audience. The way we typically use this is in a meeting anywhere from 1 to 2 or sometimes 3 hours. And I can't recall how many items we have in total. I think there are at least 40, but perhaps pick 10 or 15. And pick 10 or 15, and again, don't just force the rating, force the conversation. So sometimes what I would say is, in terms of the light version, pick 10 or 15 sub-elements, perhaps a couple from each of the dimensions, perhaps 3 from each of the 4 dimensions, and use that to drive your conversation. But the only other comment I wanted to make in that respect is listen for the feedback that you get. And so use this tool as kind of a foundation for your own building up of best practices. And what I mean by that is I at least often find that some of the best practices in various training sessions come from folks who are on front lines with citizens, either manning the phones or manning the counters or help desks of some sort, and they're the ones who often best know how well you're doing, or they're the ones who really understand what kind of ideas work or don't work. So again, my suggestion is don't rush through these 12 items, however many you want to focus on, but spend the time on each to understand how well you're doing and what does work. Because in any given organization, there are often great best practices that do occur. Just the only challenge is the forums don't exist to share them amongst each other. And so often using a tool like this is an excuse to get together and actually have that forum to listen to what those best practices might be.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I have another question, this time focusing on the issue of service catalogs, which apparently are increasingly common in not only IT help desks, but emerging for other service desks as well. And the question is there any indication of service offerings being described explicitly both for clients and agents related to catalogs?
I'm not sure, Nicholas, if I understand the question correctly, whether it's, in other words, a specific version for clients and another for agents, which is often the case. I would suggest often the more important one is for your agents, you need knowledge management systems so that as your customers become more and more capable of navigating, where you are, what you offer, your agents are supported with that knowledge, because services and programs at various levels of government will change quite often. But having another version that's also relevant for your citizens is quite important. And these service catalogs don't need to be complex. It can simply be a listing of here are all the things we offer to citizens, so that at least people can understand, yes, we offer it, and here's who to call if you do need more complex advice. But even that level of that basic catalog of here's what we offer to citizens isn't available in a number of jurisdictions we work in.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And, I know that there have been some discussions and some movement in, say, service organizations to act as a single window intake point for all services, not just transactional information services, but more complex services as well, and to triage those out to other ministries or departments that might be providing them. So use of catalogs has a relevance in that context. Another question for you, Richard. What sources did you use to develop the maturity model?
Were the similar ones we used for the broader project. We went out in two different ways. We looked across the public sector in Canada. We did a number of interviews with public sector organizations in other jurisdictions, but then we also looked at the private sector. And if you, just for those of you who are on your computers, you can see back to the approach. We listed a number of different organizations that we specifically spoke to, that we targeted, in fact, to populate some of this. So that's essentially where we, what we did to develop the maturity model.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Here's something more in the realm of a comment from one of the participants who says that they can see using this once they get more of a self-service focus in the organization, which isn't quite there yet, but that they've actually completed the assessment. And it's pointed out the need for a broader discussion to even understand where they're at in their organization. So in terms of framing the scope of the issue, it would seem that this is a potentially useful tool. Maybe you could comment on that, Richard, and how it might fit as part of a strategic or operational planning approach.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen that to the degree that you want to be very inclusive and get a lot of input from your organization as to how you want self-service to evolve. Again, this could be a great training tool to help explore what the parameters of self-service are, help give people a good feel for the degree of change that might be required, the degree of investment, and to help start thinking about various initiatives and roadmaps that you might need. But at the same time, I think one needs to be careful, because that path to self-service needs to be pragmatic. And, we've seen this do a little bit of damage at the same time, where people might feel that there's over-promising, if you will, occurring. So, people look at this and say, oh my gosh, this is great, we're going to get self-service really soon, whereas hopefully the message you're all getting is that no, this isn't necessarily all easy. It can be complex, and so I think that balance needs to be made between using this as a tool to help educate and help rate where you want to be, but also making sure you don't overpromise various capabilities to your own people, and certainly not to citizens out there.
Thank you, Richard. We're getting close to the end of our session, but maybe I'll throw out one question for you, and that's that I know that there's been a lot of interest on the issue of costing and how we frame that in our conversation around moving towards greater self-service. Where would you say in this assessment tool does that issue of costing play itself out, or can that conversation take place within the organization?
It's a great question, Nicholas, and I don't think we've got specific costs in here as a capability. to me, the cost is more the fact of, what does it cost, as opposed to some sort of capability from very basic to very, transformative. Having said that, I think a lot of these various elements would sort of build up to sort of be your cost profile. And I think that as you look through this, if you do have a number of elements that you're scoring a 1 or a 2, in other words, pretty basic, often a result of that capability, that weak capability, might in fact be a higher cost than you might normally want. But so that's kind of answer number 1. Answer number 2 is, again, for those organizations that cost you really want to go deeper on that, it's very easy to just customize this. And it's likely somewhere in your management functions tab that you can then add in, 1 or more rows that might have to do with cost. And so it could be around comp for your people. It could be around other costs, whether it's web service costs, whether it's real estate costs, other things that might be driving your overall cost profile across channels.
Okay, thank you, Richard. That's a good suggestion. So the tool could potentially be accompanied with another column that has some projections around potential cost implications. Well, I think it's time to close today's webinar. I'd like to thank you, Richard, for this very informative presentation. Clearly, we've heard just the tip of the iceberg, and we'd be interested to dig deeper if we have more time and if we can approach you as the need might arise. Merci beaucoup aussi à notre collègue pour votre participation. Thank you to all our participants for joining in. Following this webinar, you'll be sent a client satisfaction survey. Please take a few minutes to respond and help us improve our webinars. You will also receive a copy of the deck and the Excel spreadsheet from this presentation if you haven't already received that shortly. And you'll also receive a notice once the webinar that's being recorded is posted on the ICCS website. So thank you all again and have a wonderful day.